There's something intoxicating about power, especially when you believe you control the room. That night, under the humming studio lights of the dialogue room, Reese Maddox believed she did. She had done it 100 times before. She'd filleted politicians, shamed influencers, even made a Silicon Valley CEO sweat bullets on national TV. Her audience, young, progressive, razor-sharp, didn't just watch. They worshipped. They came for the takedowns, the viral moments, the thrill of watching arrogance unravel live on air. So when her producer pitched the idea of inviting William Clay, Reese didn't blink. She smiled. Of course, he was everything her audience loved to hate. A relic. A cowboy. A man built from another century, gravel-voiced, slow-talking, rooted in a kind of masculinity that made half the room roll their eyes and the other half lean forward with cautious nostalgia. William Clay had starred in 50 years' worth of films that never cared about being politically correct. Guns, grit, grey stares. He stood for values no longer in fashion: stoicism, restraint, honor. To Reese, he was a goldmine, not because she respected him, because she didn't have to. The days leading up to the taping were electric. Her writers huddled like wolves around the table, crafting zingers, biting one-liners, and just enough historical trivia to make her look devastatingly informed. The tone was clear, mockery, with a side of intellectual superiority. She'd open with a jab about his age, follow up with a comment on his outdated views, then maybe, just maybe, poke at his infamous speech to an empty chair years ago. That one never got old. "This is going to be blood sport," her head writer grinned. "No," Reese replied, adjusting her lipstick in the mirror. "This is going to be beautiful." 1,000 miles away, on a ranch where the wind moved slower and no one asked for sound bites, William Clay held the invitation in one hand and a chipped coffee mug in the other. His assistant, Ben, young, eager, still assuming the world was supposed to be fair, stood near the window. "She's not friendly territory," Ben warned. "You've seen her interviews. She doesn't aim to listen. She aims to win." William didn't flinch. "She can aim all she wants," he murmured. "I'm not here to dodge bullets." He didn't rehearse, didn't plan a narrative arc, didn't call in a publicist or ask for talking points. He packed a clean shirt, pressed his old blazer, and got on the plane. On the night of the taping, the audience filed in buzzing with anticipation. A few older viewers sat near the back, faces tight with skepticism. But most of them were fans of Reese, fans of the fight. Backstage, Reese stood in the shadows, watching the countdown clock. "Ready?" her producer asked. She smiled, teeth sharp. "Let's dance." William Clay walked in with no entourage, no noise, just him. Boots polished, eyes calm, his presence soft but strangely undeniable. He looked like a man who'd spent years listening to wind and silence, and had grown to trust both. He sat in the green room and watched her monologue begin on the monitor. It was everything they'd planned: fast, funny, ruthless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reese purred on stage, "tonight we're speaking with a legend, the last of a dying breed, a man who still thinks a squint and a gun solve everything." Laughter exploded. "And hey, don't worry, we've removed all empty chairs from the set. Wouldn't want to confuse our guest." More laughter. William chuckled softly in the green room. Ben looked horrified. "She's tearing you apart before you even step out there." William sipped water. "Let her." They called him out. He walked with steady steps, tipped his head to the audience, shook Reese's hand like a gentleman who wasn't here to play by her rules, but wouldn't disrespect hers either. "Mr. Clay," she began, voice sugar-dipped with edge, "let's talk about relevance. You've been around a long time, some would say too long." He smiled faintly. "Long enough to see the world change, and long enough to know it still struggles with the same things." From the start, it wasn't a duel, not because he refused to fight, but because he didn't need to. He didn't deflect her questions. He didn't get angry. He didn't make a show of standing his ground. He simply stood in it, and that started to make people uncomfortable. She brought knives. He brought silence. And somehow, he cut deeper than she ever could. The crowd didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something far rarer than conflict: transformation. The lights dimmed, the crowd settled, and Reese Maddox leaned forward across her iconic silver desk, eyes gleaming. This was her ring now. "Mr. Clay," she began, voice velvet, but laced with knives. You've built a legacy playing characters who settle problems with fists, bullets, and brooding stares. Do you ever wonder if maybe that's part of the problem? A beat. Polite chuckles from the audience. William Clay didn't blink. I suppose it depends on the problem, he said simply. Laughter again, but quieter. Confused, maybe. Reese pressed on. I mean, those old westerns. Gritty heroes solving everything with violence. You don't think that helped shape a generation of men who believe silence and aggression are virtues? William turned to her, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. I think those films showed people who didn't run from hard choices, who did what needed doing, even when it was ugly. There's a difference between glorifying violence and showing the cost of it. That one landed differently. In the audience, a few faces turned thoughtful. Reese shifted. She wasn't rattled, not yet. But something about his tone, calm, unhurried, threw off the rhythm she'd built her career on. She fired again. But don't you think the world's moved past all that now? Past stoicism, past all that cowboy justice? William's eyes were steady. I think the world likes to pretend it's moved past things, until it finds itself right back in them. No cleverness, no zinger, just truth, spoken like it had weathered storms. Reese wasn't used to this. Most guests either tried to match her wit or danced around her words. William Clay didn't dance. He stood still, and somehow the stillness pulled the room inward. Okay, she said, sitting back with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Let's talk legacy. She glanced at her notes, then into the camera. You've said some colorful things over the years about politics, culture, women, the press. A lot of people think you're out of step with modern values. What do you say to them? William folded his hands, thoughtful. I say they're probably right. I'm not in step with everything this world's doing, but that doesn't mean I'm out of line with what matters. What does matter? Reese asked, with that faint air of challenge curling around her words. He looked out toward the audience for a second, then back at her. Doing what you say you'll do, owning your choices, not hiding behind the crowd, and listening, especially when you disagree. The audience hushed. For the first time, Reese didn't reply right away. She leaned in. Her voice softened just enough to feel sincere. Or maybe it was involuntary. So you don't care if people think you're wrong? I care if I'm honest. Said not if I'm liked. A pause. Then he added, popularity's a wave, integrity's a compass. That one hit something. In the front row, a young man, who had laughed at every one of Reese's opening jabs, sat with his arms folded now, eyes narrowed in thought. A woman beside him nodded, almost imperceptibly. But Reese, sharp-seasoned, still in control, Mel pivoted. She wasn't done. But what about growth? She asked. Don't you think holding so tightly to your values makes you rigid, resistant to change? William chuckled, not mockingly, almost fondly. Change is good, he said. But there's a difference between bending and breaking. Reese tilted her head. Explain. I've changed plenty, he said. But the parts that held me together, I didn't let those go. You don't drop your spine just to keep up with the crowd. There was silence, real silence. The kind that only comes when people stop waiting for the next laugh line and start listening. Reese tapped her pen against her notepad. Something in her rhythm faltered. This was supposed to be easy. It had always been easy. But somehow, the more she pushed, the more she felt like the one being unwrapped. He wasn't fighting her. He was holding her, holding the room, holding attention not with performance, but with presence. She smiled again, almost wistfully. You really don't get rattled, do you? William's smile was smaller. I've been through too much to flinch at questions. She nodded slowly, then turned to the crowd. Well, she said, you came for fireworks, but I guess sometimes a fire burns quieter than you expect. The audience murmured. Something was shifting, something deep. The game had changed. She was still holding the cards, but he had taken the table. And somewhere, quietly, the audience began to wonder. Maybe strength isn't how loud you speak, but how little you need to. Reese Maddox crossed one leg over the other, trying to regain posture, not just physically, but psychologically. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She glanced at the live feed monitor behind her guest. The audience, earlier a sea of wide grins and smirks, had quieted. Phones were no longer subtly raised to capture viral burns. People were watching. Not for the next punchline, but for something else. A pause. She leaned forward again, her signature trap posture. "Tell me this, William," she said, her voice calculated but lower now. "Do you think there's anything you've said or stood for that maybe you got wrong?" William didn't answer right away. That unsettled her more than a quick no would have. He looked down briefly, his thumb brushing against the side of his coffee mug. "Plenty." "Say," he finally said. The audience collectively leaned in. "I have made mistakes. I've misjudged people, held on to beliefs too tightly, let pride make decisions I should have handed over to patience." His voice didn't tremble. It landed like gravel on wood, rough, steady, true. "But you don't correct wrong by pretending it didn't happen," he continued. "You correct it by living better after." A quiet sigh escaped someone in the third row. Reese noticed. This was no longer a performance. It was a reckoning. She shifted again, this time not out of strategy, but from discomfort she didn't yet have words for. "But you don't apologize much, do you?" she asked. "No," he replied. "I try to make the apology visible in the way I live." She blinked. No guest had ever said that. Not in those words, not with that kind of earned grace. Then she tried one more jab. "And what about the people who say you're just clinging to nostalgia? That all this talk about integrity and values is really just an excuse for not evolving?" William's lips parted slightly, a small smile flickering before he answered. "People confuse holding your ground with being stuck. I'm not afraid of change. I'm afraid of forgetting." "Of forgetting what?" "What matters, who we were, what built us. You lose the thread of that, you don't move forward, you just drift." A deeper silence followed, one that hummed with something weightier than words. Recognition. At the edge of the stage, her producer made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Stretch time. Ratings were spiking, but more than that, something was happening no one wanted to interrupt. Reese sat back, finally dropping the smirk entirely. She didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere between the third question and his sixth answer, the script in her mind had turned blank. She looked at him now, not as a man to outwit, but as a mirror. Someone who didn't fight back because he didn't need to, because he wasn't fighting her. He was speaking through her, around her, beyond her, to the crowd, to the culture, to the ache everyone carried for something honest. She glanced at her notepad, lined with quips, facts, perfectly timed jokes, and closed it. No one noticed, but maybe someone would later. "I don't usually say this mid-interview," she said quietly, "but I think we expected different things from tonight." William nodded once. "I expected to have a conversation." Another pause. "And I expected to control it," Reese replied. He smiled, not smug, not victorious, just kind. "Control's overrated," he said. "Connection lasts longer." In the crowd, someone began to clap. It wasn't wild or performative, it was slow, hesitant. Then it spread. A soft wave of applause, not for spectacle, but for something else. For the kind of truth that didn't shout, but sat beside you and waited to be heard. She had tried to set the tempo. He had changed the tune. And now, no one was dancing the same way they came in. The studio had never been this quiet. Not when Reese dropped an unfiltered monologue. Not when a senator stumbled under questioning. Not even when that pop star cried on camera. But now it felt like a church just after midnight, still expectant. Reese Maddox, still perched behind her desk, but no longer leaning forward like a predator, looked across at William Clay, whose hands were gently folded in his lap. No tension, no calculation. Just the ease of a man who had carried weight for so long it no longer asked to be named. Reese hesitated, then said softly, "William, would you mind telling us about the beginning?" A long pause. William looked up, not startled, just searching the space in front of him, like the memory lived in the air. "Sure," he said quietly, "if folks still want to hear it." A murmur of assent from the crowd, the kind that said, "Yes, please, we need it." William leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused. "You know," he began, "people look at the end of a story and think the whole road must have been smooth to get there. But it wasn't. Not for me, not even close." He chuckled. "I wasn't anyone special growing up. Just a tall, lanky kid with a voice too soft and a haircut too bad. I didn't come from money, didn't have connections. Hollywood, that was another planet." The crowd listened, rapt. "I worked odd jobs. Construction, driving trucks, loading boxes overnight. Anything to keep gas in the tank and food on the table. I didn't know how to act. Didn't go to some fancy drama school. My first audition, I walked in with my shirt untucked and forgot my own name. Laughter. Gentle. Genuine. William smiled at the memory. A casting director once looked at me and said, "Kid, you've got a voice like sandpaper and the emotional range of a doorstop." That stuck with me for a while. He shrugged. Most people would have quit. Maybe I should have. But something in me, maybe pride, maybe foolishness, just kept saying, "Not yet." He looked out at the crowd. I didn't wait for someone to teach me. I studied people, faces, body language, how folks moved when they were tired, angry, hiding something. I watched how men stood when they were scared, but wouldn't admit it. That became my training. Reese was frozen, listening like the rest of them. I got my first job as an extra in a Western. No lines. Just walk behind the horses and don't trip. I was terrible. But I watched the leads. I watched the camera crew. I watched how the director leaned forward when the scene was working. And I remembered. Another breath, slower now. Then came Raw Trail. Small studio, small role, low pay. But I had the look, and they figured I couldn't mess up standing still and squinting into the sun. That's how it started. He looked back at Reese. It wasn't about getting famous. It was about honoring the shot. You wait so long for someone to open a door. You better not waste the step inside. A quiet nod from a woman in the third row. Reese's voice, when it returned, was gentler than before. "Did you ever think of quitting?" "All the time," he said. "You get tired, broke, lonely. People talk about resilience like it's some glamorous thing. But it's not. It's dragging yourself out of bed when you don't believe in yourself. It's saying, one more try, when you've got no reason to think this try will be different." He paused. "You know what saved me?" The crowd waited, making things with my hands. I built tables, chairs, learned to cut and sand and glue and stain. When the phone didn't ring, I carved wood, because at least then I had proof I could still shape something. A long silence, then applause, slow, rising. Reese wiped the corner of her eye subtly. "You talk about all of this like it was normal, but it's not. Most people wouldn't keep going." "Maybe not, but most people could if they knew their why." Reese leaned in. "And what was yours?" "To be worth the chance." He paused. "I didn't care about fame or money. I just didn't want to prove them right, the ones who said I wasn't enough. The ones who laughed. I wanted to build something so solid it could outlast the noise." The crowd exhaled in unison. William looked toward the audience, his gaze softening. "It's not about talent. It's not about luck. It's about staying in the room long enough for the storm to pass." A young man in the front row nodded, his hands clasped tight in his lap. Reese breathed out, her voice just above a whisper. "Is that what resilience is to you?" William turned to her. "No." A pause. "Resilience is choosing to rise without needing applause for it." The audience froze, not because they were waiting for a joke, but because they weren't. They just wanted to hear what he'd say next. Reese looked down at her notes. Her pen lay untouched. The ink had dried. She closed the folder and folded her hands. "You make it sound simple." "It is, but simple isn't easy." William sat back, eyes tracing the rafters above. "Everyone's looking for a breakthrough, but most of what matters is what you build when no one's watching." "The small things," Reese said. "Exactly, the things that don't post well." That got a soft laugh from the crowd. But it wasn't derisive. It was real. William continued. "There was a time I turned down a major role. Big budget, big studio, the kind that launches careers. But the man they wanted me to play, he wasn't someone I could live with. I needed the paycheck, but I needed the mirror more." Reese's eyes widened slightly. "What happened after that?" "Nothing. For a while, I got quiet, forgotten. And then another script came. A smaller film. But the character had bones. A man trying to do right, even when he was wrong. I took it, and that's when things began to change." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken that first role?" "Yeah, I'd be richer, but emptier. Another silence. Another kind of truth. The kind that doesn't need decoration." The man had come in wearing shadows of legend. Now he sat wrapped in something rarer. Transparency. Reese Maddox looked at him, not as a host, not as a challenger, as a student. "William," she said, her voice low, You said earlier you weren't anyone special, but I think that's exactly why this matters, because people see themselves in you. He nodded. Then I hope they see this too, that it's okay to fall apart, as long as you don't stay there. A woman in the back row wiped a tear from her cheek. Reese sat quietly. Then, almost reluctantly, she asked, "Would you mind telling them more about what it cost?" William looked at the floor. The cost was time. Years I can't get back. Friendships I lost because I was too proud to ask for help. Roles I missed because I didn't play the game. And nights I spent alone, wondering if any of it mattered. He looked back up. But the return. I sleep well. I walk proud. I never sold what couldn't be bought. A beat. And somehow that's enough. The camera didn't cut. The crowd didn't move. And Reese, for once, didn't fill the air. She just nodded. "Thank you, William." He tipped his head. "Thanks for asking." And the lights, once built for spectacle, dimmed into something softer, something sacred. It wasn't the kind of silence built on tension anymore. It was the kind that settles over a room when truth has landed, and no one dares to speak over it. Reese Maddox sat still, not frozen, just listening, as if her body knew the air had shifted before her mind could catch up. She had entered the night armed with certainty, scripted jabs, timed applause, control. Now, that certainty felt like scaffolding around a house that had quietly collapsed. William Clay hadn't dismantled her. He had simply told the truth. The kind of truth that didn't demand agreement, only attention. And now the only voice echoing in her head wasn't her own. It was his. Resilience is choosing to rise without needing applause. That line played on repeat as she stared at the blinking light on the camera. The audience hadn't moved much either. A few had leaned back, a few leaned in, but none had looked away. Some had faces streaked with quiet tears. Others sat with arms crossed, not in resistance, but self-protection, like they were afraid something fragile in them had just cracked. And maybe it had. Reese finally cleared her throat. "William," she said, not to reclaim control, but to give space to what came next. "There's something about the way you speak that makes people look inward." He didn't flinch at the compliment, didn't glow with ego, just offered a small nod. "It's not intentional," he said. "I just stopped pretending a long time ago. And when you stop pretending, folks tend to hear what they're not used to." She paused. "What were you pretending back then?" He looked at her, not past her, not around her, at her. "That I was fine, that I wasn't scared, that I didn't care what people thought, that I didn't need help." Reese looked down. Something about the list felt familiar, too familiar. "Do you think everyone's pretending something?" "Most people," he said. "Some folks pretend they're better than they are. Others pretend they're worse. Either way, the pretending always costs more than it pays." She smiled, faintly, like it hurt. "You ever pretend now?" He looked at his hands. "Only when I'm trying to protect someone." The audience absorbed that like a sponge. Somewhere near the back, a man with graying temples exhaled hard and wiped his eyes. Next to him, a woman held her arms tightly around herself. They didn't know why it mattered so much, only that it did. Reese took a breath. "Do you ever wish you were someone else?" William shook his head slowly. "Not anymore. I spent too many years wishing I was someone better, someone faster, louder, more charming. Then I realized I was wasting all that wishing when I could have been becoming." She sat with that for a long moment. Becoming. The word sank like a stone into a deep place inside her. She didn't speak. Not because she was being dramatic, but because she was shifting. She could feel it. The old mechanism, always jumping to the next question, next punchline, next pivot, was still there. But it had grown quiet. Something else had taken its place. She looked up. "You've spent this entire conversation not trying to win, not trying to be impressive, just being, and that's the part I don't know how to do." William gave a sad smile. "Most of us don't. The world teaches us to perform, even in private. We get applause for image, but the soul gets neglected. What if the image is all you've built?" He nodded slowly. "Then the moment it cracks, you've got nothing underneath." Reese closed her eyes briefly. She knew he wasn't accusing her, but the truth didn't need sharpness to cut. The studio lights had dimmed slightly, a cue from the tech team to enter the emotional block of the show. But they were late. The emotion had arrived 15 minutes ago. They were just catching up. "William," she said, regaining some of her grounding, "what would you say to the version of yourself from all those years ago?" The one who felt like he wasn't enough? He looked away for the first time in a while. Not out of shame, but reflection. I'd tell him that enough isn't something you reach, it's something you decide. Reese bit the inside of her cheek. That one hit hard. He wasn't speaking just to her, he was speaking through her, to every person who had ever sat with doubt, like it was furniture in their soul. In the control room, the producers exchanged quiet glances. Ratings were through the roof, but no one was celebrating. The energy wasn't triumphant, it was reverent. One of the camera operators whispered, "We should frame this like a documentary." The director nodded. No punch-ins, no gimmicks, just truth. Back on stage, Reese shifted in her chair. "You know," she said, "this show started out as a platform for perspective. But somewhere along the way, I think I turned it into a stage for my own voice." William said nothing. He didn't need to. She looked at him, eyes clearer now. "I think I forgot how to listen." He offered her the softest nod yet. Most people forget, but it's never too late to start again. The crowd breathed. One long, collective inhale. Then Reese looked into the camera. "I know this isn't our usual show. I know you came for a clever sparring match, maybe a laugh or two. But what we got tonight, was something we don't see much anymore." She turned back to William. "A man who's not selling anything, not protecting a brand, just telling the truth he's lived." William tilted his head. "Sometimes that's all that's needed." Another long pause. Then Reese asked, "What truth do you think we're avoiding most right now, as a culture?" William exhaled. "That loneliness is real, that most people are scared, that we've become so obsessed with being right, we've forgotten how to be kind." The crowd stilled. No coughs, no rustling, just presence. "That's why we argue so loud," he added, "so we don't have to admit how unheard we feel." Reese's eyes glistened. "And what do we do about that?" William looked at her. "We start with this, with silence, with letting someone finish, with hearing not just their words, but where those words come from." He let the moment breathe, then said, "You can't fix a world you refuse to understand." In that moment, the room shifted again, not because of volume, but weight. Reese closed her folder entirely. There were no more questions, just one final exchange. "William, why do you think you came here tonight, really?" He smiled. "To remind myself that honesty still has a place." He looked out at the audience, and to remind them that it always did. The applause from earlier had faded, but something heavier had taken its place, a silence not of awkwardness, but of awe. Reese Maddox sat in stillness, eyes trained on the man across from her. The audience, who had arrived expecting combat, now found themselves in communion. No one looked at their phones. No one coughed. No one blinked more than they needed to. They were holding on. Reese looked down at the cards in her hand. Questions about legacy, controversy, gossip. She slowly turned them face down. "William," she said quietly, "I think we've spent a lot of time tonight talking about what you've lived, but I want to ask you something I didn't plan." He nodded once. "Go ahead." Reese hesitated, choosing her words like stepping stones over deep water. "What do you fear?" The crowd inhaled. William leaned back slightly, folding his hands in his lap. For the first time, his face showed something close to vulnerability. "For a long time," he said, "I feared being irrelevant, not forgotten exactly, but unseen, like the things I stood for would be buried under noise, that what I tried to build would wash away." Reese didn't interrupt. "But that changed," he continued. "Now I fear something else." "What?" "That we're teaching people to only value what echoes." He paused. "Not what's true, not what's earned, just what gets clapped for." There it was. The sentence that felt like a stone thrown into the center of the collective chest. Reese opened her mouth, then closed it. She felt her throat tighten, but not from emotion, from recognition. That was her world. That was her currency. Applause, shares, viral quips. And here was a man suggesting that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't building anything worth standing on. She leaned forward. "Have you ever betrayed yourself, chasing the echo?" William looked down, then met her eyes. "Once." Silence stretched. "I said yes to a role that didn't sit right. The script was fine. The money was great. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't a story I wanted to tell. I let the momentum make the decision." "What happened?" "The film bombed. Critics panned it. And worse, I couldn't watch it. Not because I was bad in it, but because I wasn't me in it." The room sat heavy with his words, and since then, he added. I never said yes unless it lined up with who I was. Reese exhaled through her nose quietly. Then something shifted. She turned to the audience. Can I confess something? No one answered, but no one looked away. This show, it didn't start this way. It used to be kinder, more curious. But then the clip started going viral. The views spiked. The headlines called me fearless. And somewhere in that noise, I started aiming for the moment, not the meaning. She looked down at her desk. I don't know when I stopped listening. Maybe it was when I realized listening doesn't trend. A few audience members glanced at one another. Not judgmental, just human. William's voice broke the silence. It takes courage to notice when you've drifted, more to steer back. Reese looked at him. How do you do that? By asking better questions, and by letting the silence answer some of them. A young man in the audience raised his hand. Reese turned to him, surprised. This wasn't part of the format. But tonight, format felt irrelevant. She nodded. Go ahead. The man stood. I don't have a question. Just, thank you. Both of you. I didn't think I'd feel anything watching a talk show, but I did, and I needed to. A few heads nodded. A few eyes welled. William nodded back, simple and soft. That's why I came. Reese smiled through glassy eyes. William, before we wrap, I want to give you the last word, not because it's polite, but because I think you've earned it. He looked almost embarrassed by the praise. He adjusted slightly in his seat. Then he spoke. We spend so much time trying to be impressive that we forget how to be honest. We chase being remembered when we should be chasing being real. And the truth is, he paused. None of us makes it out of this life untouched. So the best thing we can do is carry our scars like they matter, because they do. They mean we were here. They mean we tried. A tear slipped from someone in the third row. Be someone worth remembering, he said. Not for how loud you shouted, but for how deeply you listened. The room stood, not on cue, not theatrically. They just stood, like they knew they'd witnessed something sacred. Reese didn't speak. She stood too, and for the first time in her career, she let the show end on silence. No punchline, no slogan, no music swell, just truth, and it was enough. The lights dimmed not by cue, but by instinct, as if the building itself knew it had witnessed something sacred. The audience filtered out slowly, many in silence, others whispering as though speaking too loudly might unravel what they had just experienced. No one scrolled their phones. No one reached for selfies. It wasn't that kind of night, and Reese Maddox remained seated, not because she was stuck, but because she wasn't ready to leave the space where something in her had just shifted. Her producer approached gently. We need to wrap the set, he whispered. You okay? She nodded, but her gaze stayed locked on the chair William Clay had vacated just moments before. Yeah, she said, I'm just still listening. Outside, a cool breeze swept down the boulevard, brushing the shoulders of audience members as they stepped into the night. Many walked in pairs, a few alone, but each carried a silence with them, not empty, but full. A man in his 40s wiped his eyes and texted his father for the first time in a year. A woman called her sister, just to say hi. A college student drafted a note to herself. You're allowed to start over. Something had cracked open, and no one wanted to seal it shut again. Backstage, William Clay stood near the loading dock, hands in his pockets. He wasn't talking. He wasn't waiting. Just letting the night settle. His assistant, Ben, broke the silence. That was something. William nodded. It was. Ben hesitated. Did you know it would go like that? William smiled faintly. No, but I hoped it might. He turned toward the open night sky. Sometimes you don't aim to change minds. You just aim to say something true, and hope the silence carries it where it needs to go. Ben looked at him with a kind of reverence he hadn't before. You think they'll remember it? If they needed to, they will. Reese eventually left the studio through a side door, coat draped over one arm, heels in hand. She walked without purpose, or maybe with more purpose than she realized. 2 blocks later, she stopped at a park bench and sat. She pulled out her phone, stared at the screen. Notifications were flooding in, tweets, emails, trending hashtags. All her instincts told her to click, to check, to see what the world thought of tonight. But she didn't. Instead, she opened her notes app and wrote 5 words. What have I been missing? The next morning, the internet had done what it always does. Explode. Clips of William Clay's words were everywhere. Resilience is rising without applause. Carry your scars like they matter. Be someone worth remembering for how deeply you listened. Comment sections were flooded not with arguments, but with stories. Strangers telling truths they hadn't shared in years. Fathers texting sons. People quitting jobs that killed their souls. Teenagers writing letters they didn't intend to send, but needed to write. Something rare had happened. A moment that didn't divide, didn't perform, didn't scream. A moment that reminded everyone of their own quiet longing to feel seen. Later that week, Reese released a statement, not through press, but on her own page. This show was never about going viral, but somewhere along the way, I let it become that. William reminded me what conversations can do when we choose presence over performance. I'm learning, and I'm grateful. No spin, no defense, just truth, and people listened. As for William Clay, he didn't book another talk show. Didn't capitalize on the moment, didn't drop a book or a branded quote line. He went back to his quiet home, walked his land, repaired the broken fence near the north pasture. And when asked by a local reporter weeks later how he felt about the episode's impact, he simply said, "I didn't go there to change anyone. I went there to be honest. Turns out, honesty still works." The bench where Reese had sat that night became a kind of quiet landmark. Not because people carved quotes into it, not because it became famous, but because something in that space felt different now. People sat there and wrote things down, called someone, closed their eyes. A whisper of that conversation lingered, and that was enough. The dialogue room eventually returned to air. Same set, same host, but the energy had shifted. The show started slower now. Fewer jokes, more pauses, and sometimes Reese asked only 3 questions the entire episode. But people watched, because something inside them recognized something in her. A woman who had chosen presence, a woman still learning how to listen.